The crystal wine glass caught the chandelier light for just a moment before Marcus hurled its contents across my face. The Cabernet Sauvignon dripped from my hair onto my white rehearsal dinner dress as 200 guests fell silent at the Grand Oaks Country Club. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His face was twisted with rage, his voice echoing across the elegant ballroom as he screamed about my supposed betrayal, about documents I'd supposedly stolen, about how I was nothing but a gold-digging fraud who'd manipulated my way into his life. What Marcus didn't know, as he stood there in his tailored tuxedo demanding I confess to crimes I hadn't committed, was that the company he worked for, Meridian Technologies, existed because of me. Every salary he'd ever earned, every bonus he'd celebrated, every stock option he'd bragged about came from the anonymous investment fund I'd quietly built over the past decade. The same fund that had saved his precious company from bankruptcy 3 years ago, when I'd pumped $15 million into their struggling operations through my shell corporation, Lone Star Capital Partners. Tomorrow morning, Marcus Thompson would walk into his corner office as Vice President of Business Development, nursing a hangover and probably still furious about our ruined engagement. But he'd also discover that his anonymous investor had called an emergency board meeting. And for the first time in 3 years, that mysterious benefactor would be appearing in person to address some serious concerns about company leadership and workplace culture. I stood there in my wine-soaked dress, mascara running down my cheeks, watching the man I'd planned to marry destroy everything in front of our families and friends. But inside, beneath the humiliation and heartbreak, something else was growing. A cold, precise satisfaction that came from knowing that in less than 12 hours, Marcus would learn exactly who held the real power in this relationship. The morning, after what should have been my wedding day, I sat in my modest apartment in East Austin, staring at my laptop screen while sipping coffee from a chipped mug. To anyone looking through my windows, I appeared to be exactly what Marcus had always believed me to be. Diana Rodriguez, struggling freelance graphic designer, living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped one-bedroom apartment furnished with second-hand finds and clearance rack decorations. The irony wasn't lost on me that this carefully constructed persona had become both my prison and my power. For the past 3 years, I'd maintained this elaborate facade while secretly orchestrating the financial resurrection of Meridian Technologies, the company where Marcus had climbed from junior account manager to vice president. The same company, whose stock options he'd waved in my face countless times, explaining how his business acumen was building our future together. My phone buzzed with text messages from concerned friends and family members who'd witnessed last night's spectacle. The story Marcus had spun was masterful in its cruelty and creativity. According to him, I'd somehow hacked into his company's systems, stolen confidential client information, and was planning to sell it to competitors. The evidence he'd produced, doctored screenshots and fabricated email chains, was convincing, enough to turn even my own bridesmaids against me. What made his betrayal particularly painful was how perfectly he'd played his role until the very end. The caring fiancé who supported my struggling career, who never made me feel small about my modest income, who promised that love was more important than money. Even as I'd watched him gradually change over the months leading to our wedding, becoming more arrogant, more dismissive of people he considered beneath him, I'd told myself it was just pre-wedding stress. The apartment around me told the story I'd carefully crafted. Discount furniture from warehouse stores, a small TV mounted on a wall bracket I'd installed myself, art prints instead of original paintings, and a kitchen stocked with generic brands and coupon-purchased items. Every detail had been meticulously planned to support the illusion that I was barely making ends meet as a freelance designer, taking on small projects for local businesses and nonprofits. But hidden beneath the carefully arranged chaos of my supposed financial struggles was a different reality entirely. The laptop I used for my freelance work was actually a high-end machine worth more than most people's monthly rent, disguised with strategic stickers and artificial wear. The Ethernet cable that appeared to connect to basic internet service actually linked to a private network that gave me secure access to a downtown office suite that officially didn't exist. The morning news was already picking up the story of our rehearsal dinner disaster. Local social media was buzzing with cell phone videos of Marcus's dramatic accusation and my apparent humiliation. The narrative was simple and compelling. Successful businessman discovers his gold-digging fiancé's attempt to steal company secrets, confronts her publicly, and narrowly avoids a devastating marriage to a criminal. I scrolled through the comments on various posts, watching as strangers dissected my character based on 30 seconds of carefully edited footage. They praised Marcus for his courage in exposing me, sympathized with his narrow escape from marrying a con artist, and speculated about what prison sentence I might face for corporate espionage. If they only knew that the company Marcus worked for existed solely because of the woman they were now calling a pathetic wannabe criminal. Amanda Foster, the one person who knew the complete truth about my situation, had been texting me every few minutes since dawn. As my assistant and the only employee of my legitimate consulting business, she'd helped me maintain the careful balance between my public and private identities for years. Her messages were a mixture of concern for my emotional well-being and updates on the corporate response to last night's events. According to Amanda's sources within Meridian Technologies, Marcus had arrived at the office early this morning, playing the role of the devastated victim to perfection. He'd already met with the security team to discuss potential data breaches, spoken with HR about the company's reputation management strategy, and scheduled meetings with key clients to reassure them that their information remained secure. His performance was masterful, painting himself as both the hero who uncovered a potential threat and the victim of an elaborate deception. What Marcus didn't realize was that his entire narrative was being carefully documented by the same security systems I'd helped design when my investment fund had insisted on upgrading the company's infrastructure. Every email he sent, every phone call he made, every meeting he attended was being recorded by systems that ultimately reported to Loan Star Capital Partners, the mysterious investment firm that had saved Meridian Technologies from bankruptcy. The beautiful part of my situation was how thoroughly Marcus had convinced himself of his own importance. He genuinely believed that his business development skills had turned the company around, that his networking abilities had secured major contracts, and that his strategic vision had positioned Meridian Technologies as a leader in business automation software. He had no idea that every major client he'd landed had been carefully steered to the company through my network of contacts, or that the industry connections he'd bragged about were actually relationships I'd cultivated over years of silent partnership building. I opened my laptop and logged into the secure portal that connected me to my real office. Through encrypted channels, I could access the true financial records of both Lone Star Capital Partners and Meridian Technologies. The numbers told a story that would have shattered Marcus's carefully constructed worldview. His company was entirely dependent on my continued investment, his salary was ultimately paid by my money, and his stock options were valuable only because I'd chosen to make them so. The phone rang, displaying the number I'd been expecting. Carlos Martinez, my head of security and investigations, had been monitoring the situation since last night's disaster. His voice was carefully neutral as he provided his morning briefing, but I could hear the underlying anger at how Marcus had treated me. Carlos confirmed what I'd already suspected. Marcus's accusations were not just false, but they were projection. His investigation had uncovered evidence that Marcus himself had been engaging in the exact type of corporate espionage he'd accused me of. For the past 6 months, he'd been having secret meetings with competitors, sharing strategic information about Meridian Technologies' upcoming product launches and positioning himself for a potential executive role at a rival company. The documentation was thorough and damning. Email chains discussing confidential client information, recorded phone conversations about proprietary software features, and financial records showing payments from competitor companies to accounts Marcus had hidden from both the IRS and his employer. While he'd been publicly playing the role of loyal company man and devoted fiancé, he'd been privately negotiating the sale of everything he could steal. But the most devastating piece of evidence was a recording from just 2 weeks ago, where Marcus had laughed about his plan to marry me for my supposed connections in the design world, then divorce me after using my contacts to build his own consulting business. According to the conversation Carlos had captured, I was never meant to be anything more than a stepping stone to Marcus's ultimate goal of starting his own company using stolen intellectual property and client relationships. The complexity of his deception was almost admirable in its thoroughness. He'd spent months building a case against me, creating false evidence of crimes I'd never committed, while simultaneously committing actual crimes against his employer. The rehearsal dinner confrontation hadn't been a moment of righteous anger discovering his fiancée's betrayal. It had been a calculated performance designed to destroy my credibility before I could potentially expose his own criminal activities. What Marcus had never realized was that I'd been watching him just as carefully as he'd been watching me. The difference was that my surveillance was motivated by genuine love and concern, while his was motivated by greed and manipulation. I'd noticed the changes in his behavior, the mysterious phone calls, the unexplained absences, and the gradual shift in how he treated me and others. What I'd initially attributed to pre-wedding stress had actually been the pressure of maintaining multiple deceptions while planning his ultimate betrayal. As I sat in my carefully constructed, modest apartment, surrounded by the props of my false identity, I realized that Marcus had actually done me a favor. His public humiliation had freed me from the emotional obligation to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. For 3 years, I'd been genuinely torn between my love for the man I thought he was and my growing awareness of who he actually was. Now, with wine still staining my hair and the memory of his cruelty fresh in my mind, that internal conflict was finally resolved. The morning sun streamed through my discount blinds, casting shadows across the small space that had become both my sanctuary and my camouflage. Tomorrow, I would step out of this carefully constructed identity and reveal myself as the woman who'd been quietly controlling Marcus's fate for years. But today, I would let him enjoy his moment of perceived victory, his celebration of exposing the woman he'd never truly known. After all, the best revenge isn't just about the destination. It's about making sure your target never sees it coming until it's far too late to escape the consequences of their own choices. My transformation from Diana Rodriguez, idealistic, young entrepreneur, to Diana Rodriguez, anonymous puppet master, began 7 years ago in a cramped coffee shop near the University of Texas campus. I was 25, fresh out of my MBA program, and burning with the kind of naive optimism that makes you believe hard work and good intentions are enough to change the world. Back then, I'd built a small but promising design consultancy from nothing, working 18-hour days to establish relationships with local businesses and nonprofits. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My portfolio was impressive, my client satisfaction rates were exceptional, and I was making enough money to rent a decent apartment in central Austin while slowly paying down my student loans. More importantly, I genuinely loved what I was doing, helping small businesses create professional brands that could compete with larger corporations. That coffee shop meeting was supposed to be a celebration. Rachel Kim, who was then just a junior associate at a mid-sized law firm, had invited me to discuss a potential partnership opportunity. Her firm represented several small tech startups that needed design services, and she thought my work would be perfect for their budgets and aesthetic needs. We'd met through a young professional networking group, and I'd been impressed by her sharp legal mind and genuine interest in helping emerging businesses succeed. What I didn't expect was for Rachel to arrive at our meeting with a stack of legal documents and a grim expression that immediately told me our conversation wasn't going to be about new business opportunities. She ordered her coffee, sat down, across from me, and began explaining why my promising design consultancy was about to become a cautionary tale about the brutal realities of corporate America. The lawsuit had been filed 3 days earlier by Morrison & Associates, a large marketing firm based in Dallas. Their claim was as simple as it was devastating. I had allegedly stolen their proprietary design concepts and rebranded them for my own clients. According to their filing, several of my most successful projects bore suspicious similarities to campaigns they'd developed for major corporate clients. They were seeking damages in excess of $2 million, plus injunctive relief that would effectively shut down my business immediately. Rachel spread the documents across our small table, explaining each charge with the clinical precision that made her such an effective attorney. The evidence they'd assembled was circumstantially compelling. Side-by-side comparisons of color palettes, typography choices, and layout structures that did indeed show remarkable similarities. To someone without deep knowledge of design principles, it might appear that I'd systematically copied their work and passed it off as my own original creations. The reality was far more insidious. Morrison & Associates hadn't just stumbled across my work and noticed similarities. They'd been systematically targeting successful small design firms across Texas, using their superior resources to manufacture intellectual property disputes that smaller competitors couldn't afford to fight. Their strategy was brilliant in its predatory efficiency. Identify promising designers whose work showed natural evolution of current trends, claim those trends as their own proprietary innovations, then force settlements that eliminated potential competitors while enriching their own coffers. What made their approach particularly effective was their understanding of how design inspiration actually works. Every creative professional builds on existing concepts, adapts current trends, and synthesizes multiple influences into new combinations. The difference between inspiration and theft often comes down to subjective interpretation, and Morrison & Associates had learned to exploit that ambiguity through expensive litigation that most small businesses simply couldn't survive. Rachel walked me through the financial reality of fighting their lawsuit. Even if I ultimately won, which was far from guaranteed given the subjective nature of design copyright, the legal costs would bankrupt my business long before we reached a courtroom. Morrison & Associates knew this, which was why they'd structured their settlement offer to appear generous while actually being extortionist. I could pay them $300,000 and sign a non-compete agreement that would prevent me from working in Texas for 5 years, or I could spend twice that amount on legal fees with no guarantee of victory. The non-compete clause was the real killer. It wasn't just about money. They wanted to drive me out of the state entirely, eliminating a potential competitor while sending a message to other small design firms about the consequences of success. I could keep my business alive by essentially admitting guilt and exiling myself from the market I'd spent years building, or I could fight and likely lose everything anyway. Sitting in that coffee shop, watching Rachel's sympathetic expression as she explained my impossible choices, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The naive optimism that had driven my entrepreneurial dreams began curdling into something colder and more calculating. The system wasn't designed to reward hard work and innovation. It was designed to protect established players from upstart competitors who might threaten their market share. That night, I sat in my apartment with my laptop and began researching Morrison & Associates with the kind of obsessive focus I'd previously reserved for client projects. What I discovered was a pattern of predatory litigation stretching back almost a decade. They'd targeted dozens of small creative businesses across the Southwest, using virtually identical strategies to eliminate competition and extract settlements. The most disturbing part was how systematic their approach had become. They'd essentially turned intellectual property theft into a profitable business model. But my research also revealed something Morrison & Associates probably hadn't expected. I was far from their typical victim. Unlike most small business owners who focused exclusively on their creative work, I'd spent years studying business strategy and corporate finance. My MBA hadn't been just an academic exercise. I genuinely understood the coursework about market manipulation, competitive intelligence, and strategic corporate warfare. More importantly, I'd been quietly building relationships with investors and venture capitalists through my design work. Several of my nonprofit clients were actually fronts for wealthy individuals who wanted to support community initiatives, while maintaining anonymity. Through those connections, I'd gained access to Austin's underground network of angel investors, private equity partners, and corporate raiders who operated in the shadows of the legitimate business world. The plan that began forming in my mind was audacious in its scope and timeline. Instead of fighting Morrison and Associates directly, I would let them win this battle while positioning myself to win a much larger war. I would sell my design business, use the proceeds as seed capital for an investment fund, and begin systematically acquiring stakes in companies throughout the Texas business ecosystem. Over time, I would build enough influence to either destroy Morrison and Associates or force them to acknowledge the futility of predatory litigation. But the emotional core of my strategy was more personal than purely financial. I'd fallen in love with the idea of building something beautiful and meaningful, only to watch it destroyed by people who contributed nothing except parasitic legal manipulation. If the business world was actually a battlefield where nice people finished last, then I would learn to fight by their rules while maintaining my own sense of justice and purpose. The first step was selling my design consultancy to a buyer who would maintain its operations while I transitioned into a silent partner role. Through Rachel's legal connections, I found a buyer who was willing to pay fair market value while keeping me on as an anonymous consultant. This allowed me to maintain income while beginning my transformation into an behind-the-scenes investor. The second step was establishing Lone Star Capital Partners as a legitimate investment vehicle with appropriate legal protections and financial structures. Rachel left her law firm to become my full-time legal counsel, and together we created a network of shell companies, limited partnerships, and offshore accounts that would allow me to invest in businesses while maintaining complete anonymity. The complexity of our corporate structure was designed to prevent exactly the kind of targeted litigation that had destroyed my original business. The third step was building a team of professionals who could execute my long-term strategy while maintaining operational security. Amanda Foster became my assistant and day-to-day operational manager, handling the logistics of maintaining my public identity while coordinating my private investment activities. Carlos Martinez joined us as head of security and investigation, using his background in corporate intelligence to identify investment opportunities and potential threats. Within 18 months of losing my design business, I'd established a multi-million-dollar investment fund with stakes in 12 different companies across Austin's technology sector. My strategy was simple: identify businesses with strong fundamentals, but temporary cash flow problems provide capital in exchange for significant equity stakes, then work behind the scenes to improve their operations and market positioning. The beautiful part of my approach was how it aligned my personal desire for revenge with genuinely positive economic outcomes. Instead of simply destroying Morrison and Associates, I was building a business ecosystem that would make their predatory tactics obsolete. By providing alternative funding sources for small businesses, I was creating a support network that could help entrepreneurs survive exactly the kind of attack that had derailed my own original dreams. But the most satisfying element of my transformation was how it allowed me to maintain my original values while operating in a system that had initially seemed hostile to those values. I wasn't becoming a corporate raider or predatory investor. I was becoming a guardian angel for businesses that deserved better treatment than the market typically provided. Every successful investment was both a profitable decision and a small victory for the principle that good work should be rewarded rather than punished. By the time I met Marcus Thompson at a charity fundraiser 3 years later, Lone Star Capital Partners had grown into one of Austin's most successful private investment funds, with a portfolio worth over $50 million. But to everyone, at that fundraiser, including Marcus, I was still just Diana Rodriguez, struggling freelance designer who'd somehow managed to afford a ticket to a high-end charity event. The irony of our meeting was perfect in its symbolic resonance. Marcus was there representing Meridian Technologies, which was desperately seeking investors to avoid bankruptcy after a series of failed product launches and mismanaged client relationships. I was there as an anonymous guest, quietly evaluating potential investment opportunities while maintaining my public persona as someone who couldn't afford to invest in anything more substantial than coffee shop tip jars. When Marcus introduced himself and began explaining his company's innovative approach to business automation software, I realized I'd found the perfect vehicle for the next phase of my long-term strategy. Meridian Technologies wasn't just a good investment opportunity. It was a chance to test whether I could build a genuine relationship with someone while maintaining the kind of strategic deception that had become central to my identity. The conversation we had that night was illuminating in ways Marcus never realized. He spent 20 minutes explaining his company's financial struggles, their need for capital investment, and his personal commitment to turning the situation around. What he was really doing was providing me with a detailed case study for exactly the kind of investment opportunity I'd been seeking. A fundamentally sound business with temporary problems that could be solved with patient capital and strategic guidance. But more importantly, his approach to our conversation revealed something about his character that should have been a warning sign. Even though he believed I was just a struggling designer with no relevant business experience, he spent the entire evening trying to impress me with his corporate success and financial prospects. He wasn't interested in getting to know me as a person. He was performing a version of himself designed to attract someone he believed could be useful to his ambitions. That night, as I drove home in the modest Honda Civic that was part of my carefully maintained public image, I made the decision that would define the next 3 years of my life. I would invest in Meridian Technologies anonymously through Lone Star Capital Partners, allowing Marcus to believe his charm and business acumen had attracted a mysterious benefactor. Simultaneously, I would begin dating him while maintaining my struggling designer persona, creating a double-blind experiment in whether genuine love could survive systematic deception. The plan was ambitious, risky, and emotionally dangerous in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. But it was also the perfect synthesis of my business strategy and personal curiosity. If Marcus could love me when he believed I had nothing to offer, except emotional support, then perhaps I'd found someone who shared my original values about the relationship between love and money. If he couldn't, then I'd learn something valuable about both his character and my own capacity for self-protection. Looking back now, I realize that my decision to simultaneously invest in his company and date him was motivated by the same naive optimism that had driven my original entrepreneurial dreams. I wanted to believe that good people could recognize each other regardless of external circumstances, and that love could transcend the kind of financial manipulation that had destroyed my first business. I wanted Marcus to prove that my cynicism about corporate America hadn't completely destroyed my faith in human decency. But even as I was hoping for the best, I was preparing for the worst. Every conversation we had was recorded, every financial transaction was documented, and every business decision was structured to protect my interests regardless of how our personal relationship evolved. If Marcus turned out to be the man I hoped he was, then none of those precautions would matter. If he didn't, then I would be ready to protect myself from exactly the kind of betrayal that had taught me to build such elaborate defenses in the first place. The transformation of Marcus Thompson from charming boyfriend to entitled fiancé happened so gradually that I almost convinced myself I was imagining the changes. In the beginning, our relationship had felt like a refuge from the complicated game of corporate chess I'd been playing since rebuilding my life after Morrison and Associates destroyed my first business. Marcus seemed genuinely interested in my supposed struggles as a freelance designer, offered emotional support during my fabricated client crises, and never made me feel inadequate about my carefully constructed financial limitations. But as Meridian Technologies began flourishing under the anonymous guidance of Lone Star Capital Partners, Marcus's behavior started shifting in ways that initially seemed positive, but gradually revealed a darker underlying pattern. The struggling company executive who'd been grateful for any investor interest slowly transformed into a corporate success story who believed his personal brilliance had orchestrated the turnaround. With each quarterly earnings report that exceeded expectations, each new client contract that boosted revenue, and each industry recognition that elevated the company's profile, Marcus's ego expanded proportionally. The first warning sign appeared about 8 months into our relationship, during a dinner conversation about workplace dynamics at Meridian Technologies. Marcus was describing a conflict with one of the company's senior developers, a woman named Lisa Chen, who'd been questioning some of his strategic decisions about client prioritization. According to Marcus, Lisa was getting too big for her britches and needed to be reminded about proper chain of command protocols. What made this conversation particularly disturbing was how casually Marcus dismissed Lisa's concerns, which were actually quite valid from a technical perspective. Through my anonymous monitoring of company operations, I knew that Lisa had identified several potential problems with Marcus's client management approach that could create serious issues if left unaddressed. But instead of engaging with her expertise, Marcus was interpreting her feedback as a personal challenge to his authority that needed to be crushed rather than considered. The second warning sign came during our first anniversary dinner, when Marcus began talking about his long-term career goals with an arrogance that seemed incompatible with the man I'd initially fallen in love with. He outlined his plans to leverage Meridian Technologies' success into consulting opportunities, speaking engagements, and eventually his own business ventures. The way he described these ambitions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of why the company had become successful, attributing everything to his personal vision and leadership, while completely ignoring the strategic investments and behind-the-scenes guidance that had actually driven the turnaround. But the most troubling aspect of his anniversary monologue was how he talked about our future together. Instead of expressing love and commitment, he focused on how my design skills could support his entrepreneurial ambitions, how my freelance flexibility could accommodate his demanding schedule, and how our combined resources could accelerate his transition into independent consulting. He wasn't planning a marriage. He was planning a merger where he would be the senior partner and I would be the supporting player. Through Amanda's careful monitoring of my emotional responses during this period, we documented how Marcus's changing behavior was affecting my psychological well-being, despite my attempts to maintain professional objectivity about our relationship. The cognitive dissonance between loving someone and simultaneously gathering evidence of their character flaws was more exhausting than I'd anticipated. Every romantic gesture felt suspect, every declaration of love seemed potentially manipulative, and every intimate moment carried the weight of strategic calculation. The pressure intensified when Marcus began making subtle but persistent suggestions about my career direction. He started questioning why I was satisfied with small freelance projects instead of pursuing larger corporate clients. He wondered aloud whether I was being ambitious enough with my pricing structure. He offered to introduce me to potential clients at Meridian Technologies, not realizing that I already knew their business needs better than he did through my anonymous investment monitoring. What made these suggestions particularly galling was how they revealed Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of both my capabilities and my choices. He genuinely believed I was struggling because I lacked ambition or business acumen, when in reality I was deliberately maintaining a modest public profile to protect the much larger business empire I'd built in secret. His condescending advice about career development was based on the assumption that I needed his guidance to achieve success I'd already far exceeded. The situation became more complex when Carlos Martinez began reporting suspicious activity in Marcus's professional communications. Through our legitimate security monitoring of Meridian Technologies systems, we discovered that Marcus had been having unauthorized conversations with competitors about potential business opportunities. Initially, these seemed like innocent networking activities, but the pattern of information sharing suggested something more concerning was developing. The timeline of Marcus's external communications correlated perfectly with the deterioration of his treatment toward me and other people he considered subordinate. As he began secretly negotiating potential job opportunities with rival companies, his confidence grew and his empathy diminished. He started treating service workers with casual rudeness, dismissing colleagues' contributions more frequently, and showing less patience with anyone who couldn't immediately contribute to his professional advancement. One particularly revealing incident occurred during a dinner party at our apartment, where Marcus had invited several Meridian Technologies colleagues to celebrate a major client acquisition. What these guests didn't know was that the client acquisition had been carefully orchestrated through my network of business contacts, who'd been subtly steered toward Meridian Technologies based on my behind-the-scenes guidance. But Marcus presented the success as purely the result of his sales acumen and strategic vision. During the dinner conversation, Marcus began making dismissive comments about the company's technical staff, suggesting that sales and business development were more valuable than actual product development. When Lisa Chen, the senior developer, he'd been undermining, attempted to explain the complexity of implementing the new client's requirements, Marcus cut her off with a patronizing lecture about focusing on revenue generation rather than technical perfectionism. The most disturbing moment came when Lisa mentioned a potential security vulnerability she'd discovered in the company's core software platform. Instead of taking her concerns seriously, Marcus laughed and suggested that she was creating problems to justify her own importance. He told the dinner guests that technical people always tried to complicate simple business decisions, and that effective leadership meant knowing when to ignore unnecessary details in favor of big-picture strategy. Through my anonymous monitoring systems, I knew that Lisa's security concerns were not only valid, but potentially catastrophic if left unaddressed. The vulnerability she'd identified could allow competitors to access client data, compromise proprietary algorithms, and potentially expose Meridian Technologies to millions of dollars in liability. But Marcus was so focused on maintaining his image as a decisive leader that he was dismissing critical information from one of the company's most valuable employees. After that dinner party, I realized that my relationship with Marcus had become a real-time case study in how power corrupts people who lack fundamental ethical grounding. The man I'd initially fallen in love with had been charming and supportive because he'd been desperate for investors and uncertain about his professional future. But as soon as he felt secure in his position, his true character emerged, someone who valued dominance over collaboration, appearances over substance, and personal advancement over team success. The psychological pressure of maintaining my cover story while watching Marcus's moral deterioration was becoming unsustainable. Every conversation required careful performance. Every interaction demanded strategic calculation. And every expression of love felt like a betrayal of my own values and intelligence. I was essentially gaslighting myself to maintain a relationship with someone who was proving himself unworthy of either my love or my professional respect. The breaking point began building when Marcus started pressuring me to make our relationship more public and official. He wanted to introduce me to his family, attend company events together, and begin discussing marriage in concrete rather than abstract terms. But his motivation wasn't romantic commitment, it was social positioning. He wanted a girlfriend who could enhance his professional image without threatening his sense of superiority. The engagement ring he presented 6 months later was beautiful, expensive, and completely disconnected from any meaningful understanding of who I actually was or what I actually valued. He'd chosen it based on what he thought would impress other people rather than what would make me happy. The proposal itself was conducted like a business presentation, complete with PowerPoint slides about our projected future together and financial projections for our combined household income. But the most revealing aspect of his proposal was how he discussed my role in his future plans. I would be the supportive wife who handled domestic responsibilities while he focused on building his consulting empire. I would be the perfect social partner who could charm potential clients while never overshadowing his professional accomplishments. I would be the understanding spouse who accepted his demanding travel schedule and networking obligations without complaint or resentment. At no point during his proposal did Marcus express curiosity about my own dreams, ambitions, or professional goals. He'd constructed a vision of our future that required me to essentially disappear as an independent person while providing the domestic and social support necessary for his continued advancement. The fact that he thought this arrangement would be appealing revealed how completely he'd misunderstood both my character and my capabilities. As our wedding planning began, the pressure of maintaining my double life reached a crescendo that began affecting my health and professional performance. Amanda Foster started expressing concern about my stress levels, noting that the cognitive load of managing both my investment portfolio and my fake relationship was creating dangerous decision-making. Fatigue. Carlos Martinez reported that Marcus's suspicious activities were escalating, with evidence suggesting he was actively preparing to leave Meridian Technologies for a competitor while stealing client relationships and proprietary information. The final months before our wedding became a race between my desire to end the charade and my professional obligation to protect the investments I'd made in Marcus's company. If I revealed my identity too early, Marcus might be able to warn his co-conspirators and minimize the legal consequences of his corporate espionage. But if I waited too long, I risked not only my personal well-being, but also the financial security of every employee and investor who depended on Meridian Technologies' continued success. The rehearsal dinner at the Grand Oaks Country Club was supposed to be my last performance as Diana Rodriguez, struggling freelance designer. I'd planned to reveal my true identity during the wedding ceremony, transforming what Marcus intended as his moment of social triumph into a public reckoning with the consequences of his choices. But Marcus's paranoia about my supposed threat to his career had been building for weeks, fueled by his own guilty conscience about his criminal activities. The documents he'd fabricated to frame me for corporate espionage were actually projections of his own crimes, reconfigured to implicate me instead of himself. The evidence he'd assembled was compelling because it was based on real misconduct, just not mine. His public confrontation at the rehearsal dinner wasn't righteous anger discovering betrayal. It was a desperate attempt to destroy my credibility. Before I could expose the truth about his own systematic theft of company resources and client relationships. Standing there in my wine-soaked dress, watching Marcus perform his elaborate deception for an audience of family and friends, I finally understood that my experiment in love and trust had been doomed from the beginning. Marcus had never been capable of loving me as an equal partner because he'd never seen me as an equal person. His affection had been conditional on my continued subordination, and his commitment had been dependent on my willingness to sacrifice my own identity for his advancement. But his betrayal had also freed me from the emotional obligation to protect him from the consequences of his own choices. For months, I'd been hoping that Marcus would prove himself worthy of mercy, that our relationship would provide a reason to handle his corporate crimes with discretion rather than public exposure. Now, with Cabernet Sauvignon dripping from my hair and the laughter of our wedding guests echoing in my ears, I realized that mercy was a luxury Marcus had forfeited through his own actions. Tomorrow morning, Diana Rodriguez, the struggling freelance designer, would disappear forever, replaced by the woman who'd been quietly controlling Marcus's fate for 3 years. The rehearsal dinner disaster hadn't ruined my plans. It had simply moved up the timeline for Marcus's education about the true balance of power in our relationship. The morning after the rehearsal dinner disaster arrived with a crisp November chill that matched the precision of my carefully orchestrated plan. At 7:30 a.m., I walked through the glass doors of Meridian Technologies, wearing a tailored navy blue Saint Laurent suit that had never seen the inside of my modest apartment. My stilettos clicked against the polished marble floor with the rhythmic confidence of someone who belonged in corporate boardrooms, not fumbling through freelance design presentations. The security guard at the front desk did a double-take as I approached. Yesterday, he might have seen Diana Rodriguez, the struggling designer who occasionally visited for meetings. But today, he was seeing someone entirely different. The transformation wasn't just about expensive clothing or professional styling. It was about the fundamental shift in energy that occurs when you stop pretending to be powerless and start owning the authority you've always possessed. "Good morning," I said, placing my driver's license on the marble counter. "Diana Rodriguez, here for the emergency board meeting." The guard's confusion was palpable as he checked his visitor log, clearly struggling to reconcile the woman before him with whatever mental image he'd formed during my previous visits. But the meeting was officially scheduled. My name was on the approved list, and his job didn't require him to understand the corporate dynamics that had brought me here. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending through layers of a carefully constructed lie that was finally being peeled away. For 3 years, I'd ridden this same elevator as Marcus's supposedly supportive but financially struggling fiancé, listening to him explain company politics and strategic decisions, while knowing that every word he spoke was either wrong or deliberately misleading. Amanda Foster was waiting when the doors opened, her expression carefully neutral despite the satisfaction I could see flickering behind her professional demeanor. She'd been the only person who truly understood the complexity of maintaining my double identity, and she'd watched me endure Marcus's condescension while knowing that I controlled every aspect of his professional existence. "The board members are assembled," she reported, falling into step beside me as we walked toward the conference room. "All documentation has been distributed, and security is standing by as requested." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows lining the executive corridor, I could see downtown Austin spreading out below us. The city where I'd rebuilt my life after the Morrison and Associates lawsuit, where I'd created a business empire from the ashes of my destroyed dreams, where I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful position is the one nobody knows you occupy. The boardroom doors were mahogany and brass, designed to intimidate visitors and remind everyone who entered that serious money and serious power were concentrated in this space. But as I pushed them open and stepped inside, I felt no intimidation, only the satisfaction of finally revealing a truth that had been 3 years in the making. 8 board members were seated around the massive conference table, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. These were successful executives who'd built their careers on reading people and situations accurately, and they could sense that something significant was about to unfold. The mysterious investor from Lone Star Capital Partners had never attended a board meeting in person, preferring to communicate through encrypted video calls and written reports. But today's emergency session had been called with unusual urgency. I took my place at the head of the table, noting how the board members' attention focused on me with the kind of respectful attention they reserved for people who controlled significant resources. They had no idea that the woman they were observing had spent countless evenings listening to Marcus dismiss their strategic decisions while explaining what the company really needed to succeed. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying the authority that comes from years of making decisions that affect hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars. "Before we begin today's discussion, I want to address some misconceptions about my identity and my relationship with this company." The presentation screen behind me came to life, displaying the incorporation documents for Lone Star Capital Partners. My signature appeared clearly at the bottom of every page, along with photographs documenting my role as the fund's founder and managing partner. The timeline showed that I'd established the investment firm 2 years before Marcus and I had even met, and that my first investment in Meridian Technologies had been made 6 months before our first date. "My name is Diana Rodriguez," I continued, watching the board members' expressions shift from curiosity to shock. "For the past 3 years, I've been the anonymous investor behind Lone Star Capital Partners, which currently holds controlling interest in this company. During that same period, I've also been engaged to Marcus Thompson, your Vice President of Business Development." The silence in the room was absolute. Through the conference room's glass walls, I could see Marcus approaching from the elevator. Bank, undoubtedly expecting to find a routine board meeting where he could further establish his reputation as the executive who'd uncovered his fiancée's criminal activities. Instead, he was about to discover that his fiancée was actually his boss, and that she'd been documenting his criminal activities for months. The next slide showed the complete financial structure of Meridian Technologies, with every investment, every loan, and every strategic decision traced back to Lone Star Capital Partners. The $15 million that had saved the company from bankruptcy, the expansion funding that had allowed them to hire new developers, the client relationships that had driven revenue growth, all of it had originated from my investment fund, carefully structured to appear as if it came from a mysterious external source. As you can see, I explained, every major financial decision affecting this company's operations has been guided by my strategic analysis and funded through my investment portfolio. The success story you've been celebrating for the past 3 years has been the result of careful planning and substantial capital investment that originated from a single source. Marcus's footsteps were audible in the corridor outside. I could see his reflection in the conference room windows as he approached, his confident stride and relaxed posture indicating that he had no idea his world was about to collapse. The man who'd publicly humiliated me 12 hours earlier was walking into a trap that had been 3 years in the making. The boardroom doors opened, and Marcus stepped inside with his characteristic smile and authoritative bearing. He was wearing his favorite navy suit, the one he'd bragged had cost $3,000, money that had ultimately come from the company he was secretly betraying, which was funded by the woman he'd been systematically underestimating. His first reaction was confusion rather than recognition. The boardroom he'd expected to find filled with concerned executives discussing corporate security was instead occupied by someone who looked like a high-powered CEO conducting a strategic presentation. It took several seconds for his brain to process that the woman commanding the room's attention was the same person he'd accused of corporate espionage the previous evening. When recognition finally dawned, Marcus's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: confusion, disbelief, fear, and finally a kind of desperate anger that comes from realizing that everything you thought you knew about your own life was fundamentally wrong. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged as he struggled to reconcile the confident executive before him with his mental image of the financially dependent fiancé he'd been supporting. "Marcus," I said, my voice carrying the same calm, authority I'd used in countless business negotiations. "Please take a seat. We have quite a lot to discuss regarding your future with this company." The board members watched with fascination as Marcus slowly moved toward one of the chairs positioned around the table's perimeter rather than at its head. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by the careful movements of someone who suddenly realized they were walking through a minefield where every step could trigger an explosion. The presentation continued with documentation of every strategic decision that had shaped Meridian Technologies' recovery from near bankruptcy. The client acquisition strategy that Marcus had been taking credit for had actually been developed by my consulting team 18 months before implementation. The product development roadmap he'd been championing had been copied from internal memos I'd written based on market research conducted by my analysts. Mr. Thompson's contributions to this company's success, I explained, have been somewhat different from what his employment record might suggest. While he's been presenting himself as a strategic visionary driving business development, the actual source of our growth has been elsewhere. The next series of slides revealed the true scope of Marcus's activities at Meridian Technologies. Carlos Martinez's investigation had been thorough, documenting every unauthorized meeting with competitors, every piece of proprietary information that had been shared with rival companies, and every instance where Marcus had used his position to benefit external organizations at the expense of his own employer. The evidence was overwhelming in its detail and devastating in its implications. Recorded phone conversations where Marcus discussed confidential client information with representatives from competing firms. Email exchanges where he provided strategic intelligence about upcoming product launches to companies that used that information to undermine our market position. financial records showing payments from rival organizations to accounts Marcus had hidden from both his employer and the IRS. But the most damaging evidence was a recording from just 2 weeks earlier, where Marcus had detailed his plan to steal major client relationships as part of his transition to a competitor company. He'd spent months cultivating these relationships, not to benefit Meridian Technologies, but to position himself as the executive who could deliver our most valuable clients to a rival firm. The total estimated damage from Mr. Thompson's activities, I continued, approaches $38 million in lost revenue, compromised strategic positions, and stolen intellectual property. This figure includes the value of client relationships he was planning to take with him when he left the company, as well as the competitive advantages we've lost due to his systematic sharing of confidential information. Marcus appeared to be having difficulty breathing. The board members were staring at him with expressions ranging from disgust to professional fascination, clearly trying to process how someone could engage in such systematic betrayal while maintaining a facade of loyalty and dedication. The final component of my presentation addressed Marcus's elaborate frame-up attempt from the previous evening. The documents he'd used to accuse me of corporate espionage were revealed to be sophisticated forgeries, created by altering legitimate company communications to implicate me in crimes I'd never committed. But the most telling aspect of his deception was how perfectly his false accusations matched his own actual criminal activities. Mr. Thompson's allegations against me last night, I explained, were actually detailed confessions of his own misconduct, with the perpetrator's identity changed to deflect suspicion from himself. Every crime he accused me of committing was something he had actually done, documented in detail through our security monitoring systems. The psychological profile that emerged from this evidence was disturbing in its implications. Marcus hadn't just been engaging in corporate espionage, he'd been systematically projecting his own criminal behavior onto the woman he was supposedly planning to marry. His public humiliation of me had been designed not just to destroy my credibility, but to create a false narrative that would protect him from investigation when his crimes were eventually discovered. The legal documents I placed on the conference table had been prepared by Rachel Kim's law firm with meticulous attention to both corporate policy and criminal statutes. Marcus's termination would be immediate and for cause, with all benefits canceled, all stock options forfeited, and all company property reclaimed. But more significantly, complete documentation of his criminal activities would be forwarded to federal prosecutors for investigation of corporate espionage, securities, fraud, and conspiracy charges. Mr. Thompson, I said, sliding the termination papers across the table toward his chair, you have a choice to make. You can sign these documents acknowledging your misconduct and agreeing to cooperate fully with law enforcement investigations, or you can refuse and face the complete legal consequences of your actions without any consideration for cooperation. Marcus's hands were visibly shaking as he picked up the documents. The confident executive who'd thrown wine in my face less than 24 hours earlier had been replaced by someone who looked like a frightened child facing consequences he'd never imagined possible. His entire identity, professional success, financial security, social standing, and personal reputation was dissolving in real time as he read through the scope of evidence against him. I don't understand, he finally managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. How could you? Why would you? We were supposed to get married today. The question revealed everything about Marcus's fundamental misunderstanding of both love and power. Even confronted with overwhelming evidence of his own systematic betrayal, he couldn't comprehend why I would choose justice over personal loyalty. He'd assumed that emotional manipulation could override professional responsibility, that romantic relationships could excuse criminal behavior, and that love should function as immunity from the consequences of deliberate wrongdoing. Marcus, I replied, my voice carrying more disappointment than anger. You were never going to marry me. You were planning to marry someone who doesn't exist, a struggling designer who would be grateful for your support and dependent on your success. The woman you publicly humiliated last night was a performance I created to test whether you could love someone you believed had nothing to offer except emotional support. The board members observed in silence as Marcus signed the termination documents with trembling hands. His signature was barely legible, his face had taken on a pale, hollow appearance, and his entire body language conveyed the shock of someone processing the complete destruction of everything they'd believed about their own life and circumstances. Security officers were waiting outside the conference room when Marcus finished signing. They would escort him from the building, supervise the collection of his personal belongings, and ensure he had no opportunity to destroy evidence or contact co-conspirators who might still be operating within other companies. His access to all company systems had been revoked at the moment he'd signed the documents, his corporate credit cards had been canceled, and his parking space had already been reassigned. As Marcus was led away, I turned back to address the board members who were still processing what they'd witnessed. The morning's revelation had been traumatic for everyone involved, but it had also been necessary to protect the company's future operations and ensure that similar betrayals couldn't occur again. Now, I said, returning to my presentation materials, let's discuss the strategic initiatives we'll be implementing to strengthen this company's market position and corporate governance. We have significant opportunities ahead of us, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you openly and honestly for the first time. The transformation from Diana Rodriguez, struggling freelance designer, to Diana Rodriguez, controlling investor and corporate executive, was finally complete. But more importantly, the systematic deception that had been poisoning Meridian Technologies from within had been exposed and eliminated, and the real work of building something positive from the wreckage of Marcus's betrayal could now begin. Through the conference room windows, I watched Marcus being escorted across the parking lot toward a waiting police car. The investigation into his activities would continue for months, but his ability to harm this company or its employees was permanently ended. The man who'd tried to destroy my reputation to protect his own criminal activities was now facing the full consequences of his choices, while the company he'd been systematically betraying was finally free to reach its full potential. The board meeting continued for another 2 hours as we discussed new leadership structures, enhanced security protocols, and strategic initiatives that would prevent any future executive from accumulating enough unchecked power to engage in the kind of systematic betrayal Marcus had orchestrated. But throughout these discussions, I felt a profound sense of relief that the elaborate performance I'd maintained for 3 years was finally over. The woman who'd endured Marcus's condescension while secretly controlling his fate was gone, replaced by someone who could engage with the world authentically and directly. The psychological burden of maintaining a double identity had been more exhausting than I'd realized, and its removal felt like emerging from underwater into clear, breathable air. As the meeting concluded and the board members began filing out, several approached me individually to express their gratitude for my patience in handling such a delicate situation. They understood that I could have exposed Marcus's criminal activities at any time, but had chosen to gather comprehensive evidence that would ensure complete justice while protecting the company's reputation and operations. The morning sun was streaming through the conference room windows as I gathered my presentation materials, illuminating the space where I'd finally revealed the truth about 3 years of carefully maintained deception. Tomorrow, Meridian Technologies would begin operating under transparent leadership for the first time since Marcus had joined the company. The employees who'd suffered under his toxic management style would discover that their anonymous benefactor had been working to protect them all along. But the most satisfying aspect of the morning's revelation wasn't Marcus's destruction. It was the liberation that came from finally being able to operate as myself, without pretense or performance, or the exhausting maintenance of an elaborate lie. The woman who'd hidden her strength to test whether it could be loved was now free to use that strength openly and constructively. The rehearsal dinner disaster that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the catalyst for a new beginning. Marcus's betrayal had freed me from any obligation to protect him from the consequences of his own choices, and his public humiliation had eliminated the last emotional barrier to revealing the truth about our relationship and his criminal activities. As I walked toward the elevator that would carry me away from the scene of Marcus's downfall, I realized that the most important lesson from the entire experience wasn't about revenge or justice or even business strategy. It was about the power that comes from understanding your own worth, protecting that value from those who would exploit it, and using your strength to create positive change rather than simply avoiding negative consequences. The transformation was complete, and the real work was just beginning. 2 years had passed since the morning Marcus Thompson discovered that his struggling fiancée was actually the anonymous investor who controlled his professional destiny. The executive conference room at Meridian Technologies had been redesigned. Since that day, with new furniture, updated technology, and an atmosphere that reflected collaborative leadership rather than the fear-based hierarchy that had characterized the company's previous operations. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching Austin's skyline evolve as construction cranes added new towers to the downtown district. The city's transformation mirrored my own journey from hidden influence to public leadership, and I found satisfaction in knowing that both changes represented genuine progress rather than mere cosmetic improvements. Amanda Foster entered with her afternoon briefing, her tablet containing updates on the expanding network of businesses that had flourished under our guidance since implementing the management philosophy we'd developed in response to Marcus's toxic leadership style. The contrast between our current operations and the elaborate deception we'd maintained during the investigation was striking in its simplicity and effectiveness. "The quarterly reports are exceptional across the board," she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Employee satisfaction at Meridian Technologies is at 94%, the highest in our industry. Lisa Chen's research division has filed for 12 new patents this quarter, and we've received acquisition offers from 3 major corporations that will politely decline." The transformation of Meridian Technologies from a toxic workplace into an industry leader had exceeded even my optimistic projections. Without Marcus's systematic sabotage draining resources and damaging morale, the company had discovered its true potential. The brilliant employees who'd been suppressed under his management were now driving innovations that had positioned us as the dominant force in business automation software. More importantly, the workplace culture had evolved into something genuinely collaborative and supportive. The fear-based management style that Marcus had championed had been replaced by systems that valued employee expertise, encouraged creative problem-solving, and rewarded contributions based on merit rather than political maneuvering. The results had been immediate and measurable. Innovation accelerated, customer satisfaction improved, and employee retention reached levels that made us a case study for business schools. The morning's first meeting had been with the leadership team we'd assembled to replace the toxic management structure Marcus had helped create. Instead of executives who maintained power through intimidation and information hoarding, we'd promoted people who demonstrated both technical competence and emotional intelligence. The difference in energy and productivity was so dramatic that other companies were now studying our management philosophy as a model for positive organizational change. Rachel Kim, who had transitioned from my personal legal counsel to the company's general counsel, provided updates on the ongoing legal proceedings related to Marcus's criminal activities. The investigation had expanded far beyond our initial evidence, revealing a network of corporate espionage that had affected dozens of companies across the technology sector. Federal prosecutors were now treating the case as one of the most significant corporate fraud investigations in Texas business history. Marcus's trial is scheduled to begin next month, Rachel reported, reviewing her legal briefs. The prosecution has over 400 pieces of evidence documenting his activities, including the recordings we provided and additional evidence discovered during the broader investigation. His defense attorney has indicated they're considering a plea bargain, but the federal prosecutors are seeking significant prison time given the scope of his criminal activities. The evidence had been overwhelming from the beginning, but the investigation had uncovered additional crimes that Marcus had committed at previous companies, establishing a pattern of systematic betrayal that stretched back over a decade. The pry. Man who'd publicly accused me of corporate espionage had actually been one of the most prolific corporate spies in recent business history, stealing proprietary information and client relationships from every company that had trusted him with responsibility. His co-conspirators at other companies had already been sentenced to terms ranging from 5 to 12 years in federal prison. The conspiracy had been sophisticated enough to avoid detection for years, but once Marcus's activities were exposed, the entire network had unraveled quickly. The recordings we'd provided had been the key that unlocked a much larger criminal enterprise. But the most satisfying aspect of the legal proceedings wasn't Marcus's impending imprisonment. It was the broader impact on corporate governance and business ethics throughout the region. The investigation had prompted companies across Texas to examine their own security procedures, implement stronger oversight mechanisms, and create better protections for whistleblowers who reported suspicious activities. Amanda's tablet showed the latest surveillance update on Marcus's current situation. He was living in a small apartment in Houston, working at a telemarketing company while awaiting trial. His legal fees had consumed most of his savings, his professional reputation had been completely destroyed, and his social circle had evaporated as former colleagues and friends distanced themselves from association with his criminal activities. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's current circumstances were remarkably similar to the fake identity I'd maintained during our relationship. Struggling financially, working multiple jobs, and facing daily uncertainty about the future. The difference was that my performance had been a strategic choice designed to achieve specific goals, while his situation was the inevitable consequence of years of criminal behavior finally catching up with him. But focusing on Marcus's destruction had never been the primary purpose of my strategy. The real satisfaction came from reviewing the positive transformations that had emerged from exposing his betrayal and implementing the ethical business practices we'd developed in response to his toxic influence. The expansion of Lone Star Capital Partners had been remarkable in both scope and impact. Our investment portfolio now included 47 companies across 15 different industries, with a combined value exceeding $400 million. But more significantly, every investment was guided by principles that prioritized long-term value creation over short-term profit extraction. The companies in our portfolio had become known for their ethical business practices, their commitment to employee development, and their contributions to community welfare. We weren't just generating financial returns for investors. We were proving that businesses could be both profitable and beneficial to society, creating jobs that paid living wages, developing products that solved real problems, and operating in ways that enhanced rather than exploited the communities where they were located. The mentorship program we'd developed for emerging entrepreneurs had become particularly successful, providing not just capital, but also strategic guidance, legal protection, and professional networks that could accelerate their success while protecting them from the kind of predatory behavior that had once threatened my own business. Each participant had stories similar to mine, innovative ideas that had attracted attention from larger companies attempting to steal their intellectual property through legal manipulation or corporate espionage. The program had become a model for other investment firms, demonstrating that supporting emerging entrepreneurs was not only morally satisfying, but also financially profitable. The companies we'd protected and nurtured were generating returns that exceeded traditional investment strategies, while also creating jobs, driving innovation, and contributing to economic growth in ways that benefited entire communities. One of our most successful graduates was Maria Santos, a brilliant software developer who'd been targeted by a scheme similar to what Morrison and Associates had used against me 7 years earlier. Instead of facing the legal battle alone, she'd had access to our resources and expertise, allowing her to not only defend her intellectual property, but also build a company that was now valued at over $50 million and employed 200 people. Maria's success story had been featured in business magazines as an example of how proper support and protection could allow innovative entrepreneurs to reach their full potential. But for me, her achievement represented something more personal, proof that the painful lessons I'd learned from Marcus's betrayal could be transformed into positive outcomes for others facing similar challenges. The afternoon brought a different kind of satisfaction. A meeting with Lisa Chen, whose research division had become the crown jewel of Meridian Technologies' operations. The security vulnerability she'd identified years earlier, the one Marcus had dismissed as technical perfectionism, had been the foundation for developing the most advanced cybersecurity software in our industry. The Pentagon contract was approved. "This morning," Lisa announced, her excitement barely contained despite her professional demeanor. "Our security protocols will be protecting classified military communications within 6 months. The contract value is $48 million over 3 years, with options for extension based on performance." The irony was perfect in its completeness. The technical expertise that Marcus had dismissed as unnecessary complication was now generating more revenue than all his supposed business development activities combined. Lisa's innovations had attracted attention from government agencies, major corporations, and international organizations seeking the highest levels of cybersecurity protection. Under my direct guidance, Lisa had assembled a team of developers who were revolutionizing the entire industry's approach to information security. Their work was so advanced that competitors were attempting to recruit our employees with salary offers double what we were paying, but our team remained loyal because they understood they were working on projects that could genuinely change the world. The transformation extended beyond our own operations to the broader Austin business community. The exposure of Marcus's espionage network had prompted industry-wide improvements in corporate governance and information protection. Local business organizations were now featuring presentations about ethical leadership, using our company as an example of how positive culture change could drive both moral and financial success. My personal transformation had been equally significant, though in ways that were more subtle than the obvious shift from hidden identity to public leadership. The psychological burden of maintaining a double life for 3 years had created chronic stress that had affected my health, my relationships, and my decision-making capabilities in ways I hadn't fully recognized at the time. The relief of finally living authentically, of aligning my public and private identities, had been transformative beyond my expectations. My creativity had returned, my energy had increased, and my capacity for genuine relationships had been restored. The woman who'd once needed to construct an elaborate fake persona to protect herself from exploitation was now confident enough to engage with the world honestly. The dating world had been particularly interesting to navigate as my authentic self. The men who approached me now were attracted to success, confidence, and intelligence, qualities that Marcus had found threatening when he'd discovered their existence. The contrast between relationships built on genuine mutual respect and the elaborate deception I'd maintained with Marcus was stark enough to make me grateful for the painful education his betrayal had provided. But the most significant change was in my approach to business relationships and corporate leadership. The experience of being systematically underestimated and dismissed had given me insights into workplace dynamics that were proving invaluable as I continued expanding Loan Star Capital Partners into new markets and industries. I could now identify toxic management patterns before they became entrenched, recognize promising employees who were being overlooked by prejudiced supervisors, and create organizational structures that prevented the kind of systematic abuse that had driven me to develop my original revenge strategy. The lessons learned from Marcus's betrayal were being applied to protect hundreds of other employees from similar treatment. The evening concluded with a final meeting that had become a monthly tradition. Dinner with the core team that had helped me maintain my double identity during the investigation years. Amanda Foster, Carlos Martinez, and Rachel Kim had all played crucial roles in gathering evidence, protecting company operations, and ensuring that Marcus's criminal activities were properly documented and prosecuted. Any regrets? Amanda asked as we reviewed the latest financial reports showing record profits across our entire portfolio. I considered the question seriously, thinking about the path that had brought me from that coffee shop meeting with Rachel 7 years earlier to my current position as one of Austin's most successful investors and business leaders. The naive optimism that had driven my original entrepreneurial dreams had been transformed into something more sophisticated but equally powerful. A commitment to building businesses that created value for everyone involved, rather than extracting wealth through manipulation and exploitation. None, I replied, watching the sunset paint the Austin skyline in shades of gold and red. Every difficult moment taught me something essential about strength, strategy, and the importance of protecting what you've built. The transformation that had begun with Marcus's betrayal was now generating positive changes that extended far beyond the immediate participants in our original drama. The ripple effects of choosing ethical business practices over predatory exploitation were creating opportunities for thousands of employees, hundreds of entrepreneurs, and countless clients who benefited from products and services developed through collaborative rather than competitive approaches to innovation. The woman who'd once hidden her strength to test whether it could be loved was now using that strength openly and constructively, creating value that benefited everyone whose lives intersected with her decisions. The elaborate deception that had once defined my relationship with Marcus had been replaced by a commitment to transparency that was proving more powerful than any manipulation I'd ever attempted. The rehearsal dinner disaster that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something much better than I'd ever dared to hope for. Marcus's betrayal had freed me to discover not just my own strength, but my capacity to use that strength in ways that created positive change for others, rather than simply protecting myself from negative consequences. As I prepared to leave the office for my authentic home, driving my authentic car to a life built on authenticity rather than performance, I realized that the most important lesson from the entire experience had been about the liberation that comes from finally being able to live as yourself, without apology or compromise, or the exhausting maintenance of elaborate deceptions designed to test other people's character. The transformation was complete, but the real work of building something meaningful and lasting was just beginning. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that would have been unimaginable during the years of careful deception and strategic planning, filled with opportunities to create value rather than simply extract it, to build relationships based on truth rather than manipulation, and to use success as a platform for helping others rather than simply protecting yourself from those who might try to tear you down. The wine Marcus had thrown in my face at our rehearsal dinner had washed away the last pretense of a relationship built on deception and systematic underestimation. In its place had emerged a life built on authenticity, success earned through merit and intelligence, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that your prosperity is creating opportunities for others rather than taking them away. The transformation was complete, and the woman who emerged from that wreckage was stronger, wiser, and more capable of creating positive change than she'd ever imagined possible. 5 years had passed since that November morning when Marcus Thompson's world crumbled in the Meridian Technologies boardroom, and Austin's business district bore little resemblance to the city where I'd once hidden my identity behind discount clothing and carefully manufactured vulnerability. The skyline had grown taller, the economy had diversified beyond recognition, and the culture of corporate accountability that had emerged from exposing Marcus's criminal network had transformed how business was conducted throughout Texas. Standing in my penthouse office atop the newest addition to downtown Austin's financial district, I surveyed an empire built not on deception or exploitation, but on the radical concept that businesses could generate extraordinary profits while genuinely improving the lives of everyone they touched. The Lone Star Capital Partners logo adorned the building's facade, no longer hidden behind shell companies and anonymous investment vehicles, but proudly displayed as a symbol of ethical capitalism and transformative leadership. The morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed view of the University of Texas campus, where my entrepreneurial journey had begun nearly a decade earlier. That idealistic young woman who'd believed hard work and good intentions were sufficient to change the world seemed like a different person now. Not because I'd become cynical, but because I'd learned to combine idealism with strategic thinking, moral conviction with practical power, and genuine compassion with the strength necessary to protect what mattered most. Amanda Foster entered with her daily briefing, but her role had evolved far beyond personal assistant to become chief operating officer of an investment empire that now managed over $2 billion across 6 countries. The woman who'd helped me maintain my elaborate deception during the Marcus investigation had become instrumental in building something unprecedented in modern finance, a fund that consistently outperformed traditional investment strategies while maintaining the highest ethical standards in the industry. "The morning's headline numbers are remarkable," she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk with the easy familiarity of someone who'd shared every triumph and challenge of our extraordinary journey. "Portfolio companies are reporting combined quarterly revenues of $460 million, with average employee satisfaction ratings of 91% across all sectors. The Harvard Business School case study on our management philosophy has been downloaded over 50,000 times this month. The transformation of Lone Star Capital Partners from a revenge vehicle into a force for positive economic change had exceeded even my most ambitious projections. What had begun as a strategy to protect myself from predatory litigation had evolved into a comprehensive approach to business development that prioritized long-term value creation over short-term profit extraction. The companies in our portfolio weren't just financially successful, they were actively making the world better through innovative products, ethical employment practices, and genuine commitment to community welfare. Meridian Technologies had become the crown jewel of our investment portfolio, but its success was now measured in ways that transcended traditional financial metrics. The company employed over 1,500 people across 3 states, with starting salaries that were 20% above industry standards and benefits packages that included comprehensive health care, unlimited professional development opportunities, and equity participation for every employee regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy. Lisa Chen, the brilliant developer whose expertise Marcus had dismissed as technical perfectionism, was now Chief Technology Officer of a company whose cybersecurity innovations were protecting critical infrastructure for governments and corporations around the world. Her research division had generated over 300 patents, created 2 entirely new categories of software products, and established partnerships with institutions ranging from the Pentagon to the European Union. But the most significant measure of our success wasn't financial returns or market recognition. It was the transformation of workplace culture throughout our portfolio companies. The fear-based management style that Marcus had exemplified had been systematically eliminated, replaced by collaborative leadership structures that valued employee expertise, encouraged creative problem-solving, and rewarded contributions based on merit rather than political maneuvering. The results had been so dramatic that business schools were now teaching courses based on our management philosophy, and executives from Fortune 500 companies were paying substantial consulting fees to learn how we'd achieved such extraordinary levels of employee engagement and innovation. The toxic culture that had once characterized too many Austin businesses was being replaced by more ethical and sustainable approaches to leadership and development. Carlos Martinez joined our morning meeting with updates on the expanded security and investigation division he now headed. What had begun as surveillance of Marcus's criminal activities had evolved into a comprehensive corporate intelligence operation that helped companies identify and eliminate internal threats before they could cause significant damage. His team's expertise in detecting fraud, espionage, and systematic misconduct had become so valuable that we were fielding requests from international corporations seeking our services. The quarterly threat assessment shows interesting patterns, Carlos reported, reviewing his tablet with the methodical precision that had made him indispensable during the original investigation. Corporate espionage attempts are down 67% compared to 5 years ago, largely because word has spread about the consequences of targeting companies in our network. The deterrent effect of Marcus's prosecution has been more effective than any security system we could have installed. Marcus's trial had concluded 3 years earlier, with a sentence of 12 years in federal prison, but the broader impact of his prosecution had continued reverberating throughout the business community. The systematic network of corporate spies he'd been part of had been completely dismantled, with over 40 executives across 6 states facing criminal charges. The investigation had revealed the scope of corporate espionage in American business, leading to new federal legislation and enforcement mechanisms that made such activities far more dangerous for potential perpetrators. The morning's first meeting was with representatives from the Diana Rodriguez Foundation, the charitable organization I'd established to support entrepreneurs who were facing the kind of predatory litigation that had once threatened to destroy my own business. The foundation provided legal support, strategic guidance, and financial assistance to small business owners who were being targeted by larger companies seeking to eliminate competition through systematic abuse of the legal system. In the 5 years since its establishment, the foundation had helped over 300 entrepreneurs successfully defend their businesses against fraudulent intellectual property claims, predatory lawsuits, and corporate espionage attempts. The success rate was remarkable. Over 90% of the businesses we supported not only survived their legal challenges, but went on to become profitable enterprises that created jobs and contributed to their local economies. The foundation's most recent success story was particularly satisfying. Elena Vasquez, a young architect whose sustainable building designs had attracted attention from a major construction corporation, had been targeted by a lawsuit claiming she'd stolen proprietary techniques from their internal research division. The claim was baseless. Elena's innovations were based on her doctoral research at MIT, but the legal costs of defending against such accusations would have bankrupted her small firm. With the foundation's support, Elena had not only successfully defended her intellectual property, but had also uncovered evidence that the construction corporation was systematically targeting minority-owned businesses with fraudulent litigation designed to steal their innovations. The countersuit had resulted in a $50 million judgment against the corporation and criminal charges against 3 of their executives for conspiracy and fraud. Elena's architectural firm now employed over 200 people and had designed sustainable buildings in 12 countries. Her success had inspired other entrepreneurs to resist predatory litigation rather than accepting coercive settlements, and her case had become a landmark precedent for protecting intellectual property rights of small businesses against corporate raiders. The afternoon brought a different kind of satisfaction. The monthly meeting with the mentorship program participants who reminded me of my younger self. These were brilliant, ambitious entrepreneurs whose innovative ideas had attracted attention. From larger companies attempting to steal their intellectual property through legal manipulation or corporate espionage. Instead of facing these challenges alone, they now had access to resources and expertise that could protect their innovations while accelerating their success. The program had evolved into something resembling a graduate school for ethical entrepreneurship, where participants learned not just business strategy and financial management, but also the importance of building companies that created value for all stakeholders rather than extracting wealth through exploitation and manipulation. The curriculum included case studies of Marcus's criminal network, not as a cautionary tale about individual bad actors, but as an illustration of how systematic, unethical behavior ultimately destroys value for everyone involved. One participant, David Kim, had developed revolutionary solar panel technology that could reduce manufacturing costs by 40% while increasing energy efficiency by 25%. His innovations had attracted interest from several major energy corporations, But instead of trying to steal his technology through predatory litigation, they were now competing to offer him partnership deals that would allow him to maintain control of his intellectual property while accessing the resources necessary to scale his production. David's success represented the broader transformation in how established corporations approached innovative startups. The legal precedents established through Marcus's prosecution and related cases had made it far more dangerous for large companies to engage in intellectual property theft. While the success of our mentorship program had demonstrated that collaborative partnerships generated better outcomes than predatory acquisition strategies. The evening's final meeting was with Rachel Kim, whose law firm had grown from a small practice specializing in startup legal services into one of Austin's most prestigious corporate law firms. Her expertise in intellectual property protection and corporate governance had made her the go-to attorney for entrepreneurs seeking to protect their innovations from predatory behavior, and her success had inspired a new generation of lawyers to specialize in defending rather than exploiting emerging businesses. The legislative update is encouraging, Rachel reported, reviewing the latest developments in corporate governance reform. The new federal regulations on corporate espionage have been more effective than anyone anticipated. Reported incidents are down 72%, and the conviction rate for cases that do proceed to trial is above 90%. The deterrent effect has been remarkable. The legal landscape had been transformed by the precedents established through Marcus's case and the broader investigation into corporate espionage networks. What had once been a relatively low-risk, high-reward criminal activity had become extremely dangerous for potential perpetrators, with severe criminal penalties and civil liability that could destroy both individual careers and corporate reputations. But the most significant change wasn't in enforcement mechanisms, it was in corporate culture. The business community had learned that ethical behavior wasn't just morally superior to predatory practices, but also more profitable in the long term. Companies that invested in genuine innovation, collaborative partnerships, and ethical employee treatment consistently outperformed those that relied on theft, exploitation, and systematic misconduct. As the sun set over Austin's transformed skyline, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from that coffee shop meeting with Rachel 8 years earlier to my current position as one of the nation's most successful investors and business leaders. The naive optimism that had driven my original entrepreneurial dreams had been tempered by hard experience, but it had never been extinguished. Instead, it had been refined into something more sophisticated and more powerful, a commitment to building businesses that created genuine value rather than simply extracting wealth from others. The woman who'd once needed to hide her strength to test whether it could be loved had become someone who used that strength openly and constructively, creating opportunities for thousands of employees, hundreds of entrepreneurs, and countless clients who benefited from products and services developed through collaborative rather than competitive approaches to innovation. The elaborate deception that had once defined my relationship with Marcus had been replaced by a commitment to radical transparency that was proving more powerful than any manipulation I'd ever attempted. The companies in our portfolio operated with unprecedented openness about their financial performance, strategic decisions, and operational challenges. And this transparency had generated levels of employee engagement and customer loyalty that traditional businesses struggled to understand. My personal relationships had been transformed as well. The psychological burden of maintaining a double identity had been replaced by the freedom that comes from living authentically, and the difference was evident in every aspect of my life. The men who were now attracted to my success, confidence, and intelligence were fundamentally different from Marcus, who had been threatened by those same qualities when he'd discovered their existence. I'd been dating Michael Chen, Lisa's older brother and a successful architect in his own right, for over 2 years. Our relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine admiration for each other's professional achievements. The contrast with my elaborate deception with Marcus was so stark that it served as a constant reminder of how much I'd grown and changed through that painful experience. Michael knew everything about my history with Marcus, the investigation, that had exposed his criminal activities, and the strategic deception I'd maintained during our relationship. Instead of being intimidated by my success or suspicious of my past, he was impressed by my resilience and inspired by my commitment to using my experiences to help others facing similar challenges. The evening concluded with a final review of the strategic initiatives we'd be implementing over the coming year. Lone Star Capital Partners was expanding into international markets, with planned investments in emerging economies, where our management philosophy could have even greater impact on local business cultures. The mentorship program was being replicated in 6 other cities, and the Diana Rodriguez Foundation was preparing to support entrepreneurs in 12 countries. But the most exciting development was the establishment of the Center for Ethical Entrepreneurship at the University of Texas, which would provide research, education, and practical support for the next generation of business leaders. The center would be funded by donations from our portfolio companies and managed by professors who understood that successful businesses could be both profitable and beneficial to society. The curriculum would include case studies of Marcus's criminal network, not as entertainment or revenge fantasy, but as serious academic analysis of how unethical behavior ultimately destroys value for everyone involved. Students would learn to identify toxic management patterns, recognize predatory business practices, and develop the strategic thinking necessary to protect their innovations while building companies that created genuine value. As I prepared to leave my office for the weekend, I paused at the wall display that had become a tradition in our headquarters. Instead of the typical corporate awards and achievements, we displayed photographs and brief stories of the entrepreneurs we'd supported, the employees whose careers had flourished in our portfolio companies, and the communities that had benefited from our commitment to ethical business practices. The display included a photograph from Marcus's sentencing hearing, not as a celebration of his destruction, but as a reminder of the importance of accountability and the consequences of systematic betrayal. He was now serving his sentence at a federal prison in Colorado, where he was reportedly working in the library and participating in educational programs designed to help white-collar criminals understand the impact of their actions on others. I'd received a letter from Marcus 6 months earlier, his first communication since the investigation had begun. The letter was a genuine apology, acknowledging the harm he'd caused to me personally, to Meridian Technologies as an organization, and to the broader business community through his criminal activities. He'd taken responsibility for his choices without attempting to minimize their impact or shift blame to external factors. The letter had also expressed admiration for what I'd built from the wreckage of his betrayal, recognizing that my success hadn't been motivated by revenge but by a genuine desire to create something better from the lessons his actions had taught. He'd asked for no response, expected no forgiveness, and requested no assistance with his appeals or parole proceedings. It was simply an acknowledgement of reality and an expression of regret for choices that couldn't be undone. I'd chosen not to respond to the letter, not out of continued anger or desire for punishment, but because the woman who'd been engaged to Marcus Thompson no longer existed. The person who'd endured his condescension while secretly controlling his fate had been transformed by that experience into someone whose energy was focused on creation rather than retribution, on building rather than destroying, on helping others rather than simply protecting herself. The transformation that had begun with Marcus's betrayal was now complete, but the impact of that change was still expanding. Every entrepreneur we supported, every employee who flourished in our portfolio companies, and every community that benefited from our ethical business practices represented a victory over the predatory culture that Marcus had exemplified. The wine he'd thrown in my face at our rehearsal dinner had washed away more than just makeup and false pretenses. It had eliminated the last barrier between who I'd been pretending to be and who I actually was. The humiliation he'd intended to inflict had instead freed me to discover strengths I hadn't known I possessed, and to use those strengths in ways that created lasting positive change. As I walked toward the elevator that would carry me down from my authentic office to my authentic car, driving to my authentic home to spend the weekend with people who knew and valued the real me, I realized that the most important lesson from the entire experience hadn't been about revenge or justice or even business strategy. It had been about the transformation that becomes possible when you stop trying to be who others expect you to be and start becoming who you're actually capable of being. The rehearsal dinner disaster that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of something far more meaningful and lasting than I'd ever imagined possible. Marcus's betrayal had taught me that strength without wisdom was destructive, but wisdom without strength was powerless. The combination of both, guided by genuine compassion and commitment to ethical behavior, had proved capable of creating changes that extended far beyond any personal satisfaction or individual success. The woman who emerged from that wine-soaked wreckage was stronger, wiser, and more capable of creating positive change than she'd ever dreamed possible. The transformation was complete, and the future stretched ahead filled with opportunities to build rather than destroy, to create rather than extract, and to help others discover their own capacity for transformation and growth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.